Hey folks, welcome to Scholar About Tarot. Just call me Mayfield, and thanks a ton for stopping by the study space. Today we're going to get started on our very first tarot book report with the Tarot Restless by Winslow Dumaine. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'll be working with the third edition here. There was a first edition all the way back in December 2017, which had a goal of about $1,000 and raised nearly $15,000. There was also a second run of just not very many. I think it was like 500 decks in mid-2018 with some corrected art, and I believe it was new card backs and white borders, which I thought was kind of cool. But for our intents and purposes, we're going to be working with a third edition, which I will go ahead and show you really quick. Does have black borders, and it looks like there's a banner on each title card. But just a really quick overview of the box, because it is actually a little important here. So the box has like this stamping effect of our sigil here, which is the same thing that we see on the altar cloth. And on the inside, we have two wedding rings, which that's going to be a little bit important later on, and it is related to our image that we see right here of a hand with a severed ring finger. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Now, I was really struggling on figuring out how I wanted to present this deck to you guys. There are a plethora of unboxings and flip-throughs of this deck already out there on the YouTubes, but what we're doing here is going to be a little bit different. I will flip through a couple of the cards just so you can get an idea of what we're looking at here, but then I will take a couple of closer readings at some different cards that I do have in a separate pile. So, as you're probably already seeing, I will issue a little bit of a trigger warning that there is a lot of gore and I guess nudity in this deck as well, and we are going to be dealing with themes of pregnancy and infertility and a bunch of other different things. So if that's not your jam right now, not in the right headspace, you will not hurt my feelings by clicking off here. I mean, taking this deck at face value, this is the perfect stereotype for shadow work, you know? But really looking into the world of the Tarot Restless, I mean, it shows a mundane post-apocalyptic world where we ignored all of the warning signs. It's a deck born of heartbreak that embraces suffering, prompting the reader to utilize that pain as a tool. The text depicts worldwide infertility and the societal consequences that Dumaine would imagine come with it. So what exactly are we supposed to do with that? Oftentimes, when I do close readings of any kind of primary text, I prefer to draw my attention to the context that surrounds the making of a text, which kind of leads me to my reason for choosing this deck first. I mean, the short answer is that it was kind of easier to jump into. And I mean, long answer, it wasn't easy in the sense of content per se, because many of the major arcana use alternative names, and the deck in general is very rich with lore that kept me busy forever. But finding the thesis was pretty easy. Like, it's literally written out for us in the guidebook, which is, by the way, where I lived in for the last several weeks. But yes, it is in the forward and is it's alluded to quite often in the guidebook. And I'll go ahead and quote directly from Dumaine's website, where you can find the listing for this deck. The goal of this work is to help guide people through traumatic experiences so they can use their pain to foster new growth. Suffering is a part of life. With this work, I hope you can use your pain to create new strength. And I mean, take a look at the cards. There's a lot to work with here. And we will be having a discussion in just a moment about what exactly we make of art like this, especially when it comes to of doing a reading with these kinds of cards. Because as I mentioned earlier, yes, this is a pretty great stereotype for shadow work, but I think there's a lot more to that, and also a lot less to that too. Because this in and of itself is quite a world building experience, and we will get to why in just a moment. And just as a side note, you probably already noticed that there are some additional cards. There's the standard 78 major and minor arcana, and the court cards as well. And then we also have 12 zodiac cards and 10 inimical oracle deck. So it's like 10 cards. Anything that's more than 80 cards does like intimidate me a little bit, but because of that, I usually separate the 78 cards from the other ones, and I just use the other ones as like a little oracle deck, and that works really well for me. Real quick, so each card comes with a short story. Let me actually zoom out a little bit. So each card comes with a short story. The illustration might be a character, a scene, or a snippet of that vignette. The overarching narrative is that the betrayer gods cast a curse on humanity, rendering them infertile, and fallout ensues. The various planes of existence merge, and some very strange things begin to happen. Dumaine notes that this is supposed to be the foundation of a larger novel called Fraught Hours, where a young woman navigates this world, and I think she's in here too. Almost every character gets a name in this guidebook, except for her. Some of the cards, while not depicting her in much detail, I don't think describe a young woman encountering what we see in the card. I could absolutely be wrong, but that's my headcanon. It makes it very Alice in Wonderland-esque, which massively helps with the immersion into this world. Which is very important because some of the deviations from the RWS system can mess with me sometimes. And, I mean, one could easily use this deck without the guidebook after all. I still found it to be a great reader using only what I know about the system that's, like, most comfortable to me. But if this is your first and only deck and all you have is that guidebook, you're getting a Dungeons & Dragons expansion pack. I'd personally call that a feature, especially since, you know, Dumaine made understanding each suit so user-friendly. So I think it actually might be a good idea to get started with the, well, I was gonna say obvious, but to be honest, like, I guess all three of these themes are obvious. I'll start it like this. There are three themes in particular that I noticed when reading through the Restless Meditations, which is the guidebook. So there are gender and gender roles. There is also the monstrous and the grotesque. And then we have the divine. And I guess to a certain extent, humanity. Yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. Let's go with that. And it was really interesting to see all three of these just intertwined with one another because it creates such rich lore in this work. And I'm super excited to see where this lore takes Dumaine because there's a lot to work with. And we'll get to some of the specifics because there's a lot of them, and it's both a virtue and a vice for this deck. It's still a great reader, but you're gonna be busy for a really long time if you decide to embark on this tarot deck. But let's go ahead and talk about it. All right, so let's go ahead and see what's up with gender and gender roles. What's the big hubbub here? I mean, I'm sure it's a big fat duh for some of you guys, because I mean, this deck is supposed to be, what would we call it? Ooh, this is great. Okay, zooming in a little bit more, that way you can see a bit more detail. But gender and gender roles are probably the biggest ones, in my opinion, the biggest theme in the Tarot Restless, because it works both forefront of the narrative, but also in the background. Like in this card here, the open grave, you probably wouldn't have known that this was a feminine character or, you know, a woman if you didn't have the guidebook with you. And I think that the gender representation here is really quite down to earth. I mean, despite how dramatic it can be sometimes, because the Tarot Restless in some ways can be seen as a journey through gender and those gender roles when that might go into question in the midst of an infertility apocalypse. I mean, with that said, themes of gender, sex, and what it means to perform or not come around quite often. And I actually noticed that the Suit of Wands it often depicted scenes of women who swore to protect themselves against villages who wanted to control them, particularly this Five of Wands right here. Hey folks, Editing Mayfield here. It looks like I might have lost a little bit of footage, but no matter, I do have quite a bit to say about two of the cards from the Suit of Wands. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Suit of Wands is essentially a suit of justice for the Tarot Restless, and two cards in particular that demonstrate not only this concept of justice, but justice done by women is in the Five of Wands, entitled The Shadow of the Night Knives, and the Nine of Wands, entitled In Covetous Howls. And both of these cards have pretty similar storylines, however, they are kind of different in the way that they seem to be portraying these women who are rising up against the injustices carried out by them from this phenomenon that was not their fault at all. So again, there's an infertility apocalypse, and in the Five of Wands, we have a village that carried out these painful experiments that really dwindled down to just plain torture, because the men of this village were essentially blaming the women for this infertility crisis. But in the imagery, which I will put a picture up here, you should be seeing it now, these women are not taking it anymore, and they are rising up against their village and completely rebelling. Whereas in the Nine of Wands, we have an image of what I assume to be a man being burned at the stake. But in the story, like, you wouldn't necessarily have known that without reading the story, because I'm honestly just inferencing that. I'm just assuming things, because in the story, we see an exchange between this, badass woman on a horse who is talking down at this beaten up dude, and she's essentially just asking for information, and she's paying him off. But meanwhile, there is a passage that says that this village that they're passing through is like on fire. And that's why I'm kind of assuming that there is a lot of carnage that's going on in an effort to save the women and other people who, can get pregnant. That way they can rescue them and not be subjects to this violence anymore. So yes, I just wanted to hop on here and give you the rundown, because looks like I lost a little bit of footage there. So back to our scheduled programming. Thank you. But in that same vein, well, not completely in the same vein, in a slightly similar shift, we'll say, in the Suit of Pentacles, or here the Suit of Stars, there tended to be more stories of men who swore against the gods for quote-unquote cursing them. The Three of Pentacles, the Four of Pentacles that you see here, are some of the cards that made me think that within the context of the Tarot Restless origins, Dumaine did suffer a lot of abuse and heartbreak from an ex-partner. And I don't think I'm out of line for mentioning that, since it's kind of a crucial detail that even lies within the packaging of the deck and is mentioned throughout the Guidebook's intro. But considering this, I think the most striking card was perhaps the Devil card that you see here, which is relabeled as the Degenerate, which I'm going a little bit off script here, but it just screams incel to me. Because this creature here probably did suffer heartbreak. However, they twisted themselves into such a manner that they claim themselves as being a victim when they quite clearly are not. And I found that to be rather interesting. So Dumaine makes some bold choices in dragging the divine down from heaven in this deck. What's cool is that the ace of each suit depicts like different aspects of this world's origin or her end story. And I thought that that was very helpful in understanding each suit. And even so, like he's pretty upfront about what his intentions are for each of the suits. But like in a nutshell, I mean, the swords is the suit of mastery. The wands is the suit of justice, which we refer to in our gender segment. The cups is in reference to sustenance, and the stars or the pentacles is related to knowledge, which was also really quite gendered in that entire suit. And I think it was a really smart decision to focus a little bit on what's called the ineffable beyond, which is where the formless ones and the miasma dwell, and that's essentially what we're looking at here. They're basically gods that are either not gods yet or are so divine that they don't exactly need a form. And it's really cool how he basically talks about the birth and growth of gods in this world. And I think we are going to get to one in just a moment. But this has been, the way that the aces are done, it was just massively helpful. And I mean, yeah, of course they look really cool. Here's an example of not a formless one, but something that I actually found to be really funny. This is the card called the Liminal Funeral, also the Five of Stars. And it's basically about an unequal one that you see here. An unequal one is like a half-formed god. And since he doesn't really have any worshippers or anything like that, like he just doesn't really have his fully formed powers or anything like that, and he's just chilling in a cave just to exist, if we can even call it that. But after humanity was rendered infertile, there was a nearby village or a nearby town that wanted to seek revenge against the gods. And what ends up happening, this is technically not funny, but it's funny out of context, I guess. But these bandits essentially go into the cave knowing that there is some sort of unequal one, but not really being able to differentiate between an unequal one and like an actual like patron god, that they start like mobbing him. And like the look on his face just screams actually, but he's like, wait, no, I'm not the one that did this, like stop it. And so just the way that we see treatment of various types of the divine, and that there are even categories of that divine, but humanity probably wouldn't know that even if it bit them in the faces, right? So I thought that this was a really cool lore building right here. Now, in this category of the divine, I also wanted to show, I guess, I don't even know if we can call this the category of the divine at this point. I think this is just lore building, because I had a lot of fun with these three cards here. And a big shout out actually to the Alleyman's Tarot by 7 for including this card into the guidebook, or excuse me, I think, was it one of the booster packs? No, I think it might have actually been an actual card. I don't have it in front of me, but you might see it in a future video. But this was really cool because the way that 7 wrote out like basically what this card meant and what this card was depicting was just a massive help. If it wasn't for that entry, for this card probably wouldn't be here. But this is basically the bell that started the infertility apocalypse. And if you can see in the background, I do believe that is the same tower that we see here. And I did also want to make mention of this guy. So this card is Treachery, which is this deck's Temperance. And this is basically our big baddie of the deck. His name is Kralish, and interestingly enough, he is a patron god of nature and beauty. And you wouldn't know that from looking at him, but I mean that's what he is. And he's a very hearth and home type of god, which I guess shouldn't really surprise us, since he's one of the ones that's responsible for what happened to humanity, because he wanted humanity gone, because, you know, they're not all that great for his domain, as it were. Like, I'm fairly certain I saw his name referenced in some of the other short stories, but he's finally, like, revealed in this card, because it must needs be remarked. In the Restless Meditations, the way that the book is the way the book presents all the cards, it's minor arcana first, and then major arcana later. And because of that, that can be a little bit jarring. And that actually does lead me into my one criticism, and even then it's not really that much of a criticism. There is central lore, yes. And I know I mentioned that the Betrayer God here was referenced a few times, but there are a lot of names, locations, and objects that would only be mentioned once. So that's it. The lore is a tad stretched. Like, yes, Dumaine, please make a fantasy horror novel or whatever so you can flesh everything out. But again, I do want to emphasize that going into it with the expectation that you are the main character makes it a ton more accessible. And remember, if you're digging this art but are put off by the backstory commitment, you don't have to use the guidebook. It still works plenty great as a standalone or even as an oracle deck, because there's a lot to work with the Inimical Oracle and the Zodiac cards. And there's a lot to be gained from some of these images and what they might mean. Now, one of the central questions that I tend to have for really any form of text or media, doesn't matter what form it comes in. I mean, the question that I have usually is, you know, what does it mean to be able to perform playing something? And that goes the same for tarot. You know, what does it mean to perform a reading with a particular art aesthetic or a particular card shape or whatever you might have? And I think it's important to ask this of particularly grotesque decks, or even decks that we would, again, stereotypically use for shadow work. So what do we do with that kind of thing? And I wanted to bring up one of Dumaine's stand-up bits that he lists on his website. It's called Winslow Dumaine in Thalia Hall, and he centers his experience with abuse, heartbreak, and the processing of that trauma within the making of the Tarot Restless. And a point of interest in that bit was a small complaint, for a lack of a better term, regarding the status of his success as an indie creator. Editing Mayfields, play the clip.
And I'm an artist, I'm an illustrator, and I'm a writer, and so I hand illustrated a whole deck of tarot cards. I drew all 78 cards, and I wrote a short story for every single card. I put it all together, funded it through Kickstarter, and I've sold $25,000 of tarot cards this year. What the fuck? I came to this city to be a comedian. You fuckers hired me as a sorcerer. God damn it. No, I came here, I was like, listen, I've been on big shows, I've been on festivals, put me on your show. And Chicago is just like, no, we need an angry wizard to gentrify the muggles out of Logan Square.
So I know this is a comedy bit, therefore, you know, scripted narrative, but a quick analysis of this indicates that, you know, Homeslice found some success among a community that he didn't intend to lure in. But I'd argue that for any artist to take on 78 cards, I mean, that's becoming a master right there. Sorry if I'm messing with the thing. And I wanted to share with you guys a special book that I wanted to use specifically for this deck, and perhaps other decks, because you might see this work again. Here is Monsters in the Classroom, Essays on Teaching What Scares Us, edited by Dr. Adam Golub and Dr. Heather Richardson Hayton. Now, this collection of essays details pedagogy within the context of monster studies, because yes, that is a thing, and I felt it was relevant to Dumaine's thesis on using pain and trauma alongside tarot as a tool. And so in this we have, and I hope I bookmarked it, I sure didn't, this one right here. So this is Creating Visual Rhetoric in the Monstrous by Nancy Hightower. And she basically shares her pedagogy in assigning a creative project in which her students create a mundane moment of pain or annoyance into a grotesque work of art. Now, Dr. Hightower explains that the grotesque is labeled as something unnameable and mundane, and further explaining the monster, or in this case, that grotesqueness, is an action or a moment, which is the perfect concept to describe Dumaine's art here. The first thing I noticed on my very first flip through was that a good chunk of cards depict someone in the middle of a transformation. And I wanted to actually point you to this one, the Eight of Swords, because I don't believe, if I remember correctly, in that story, she did not look like this when that short story began. And I find that to be quite interesting, since, you know, the Tarot Restless portrays these mundane acts twisted and distorted further and further until they cease to be human. Now, the Tarot Restless is a text that promotes healing through unorthodox methods of the grotesque. The reader may engage with some of the most painful feelings we might have to work with, whether we wanted to or not. It's a means to create meaning of the suffering we endure with a healthy level of curiosity and action that we see in the cards. I really loved the experience of reading this guidebook, and if you give this a chance, I hope you will too. Dumaine is so clear and full of purpose in what he's aiming for in sharing this work. It was a lot of fun getting a glimmer into Dumaine's headspace while reading through each card's story, because at the end of his guidebook, he shares a list of inspirations for this deck. So as I read through all of the short stories, I listened to a couple songs that he probably would have listened to while completing his project. Lots of black metal in this list of musical inspirations, which, you know, honestly, like, that checks out. But black metal sets a stage, illustrating movements of that spiraling grotesqueness, sorrow, and even power of this world. I tried to stay within the realms of listening to stuff circa mid-2010s when he would have illustrated the Tarot Restless, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't deviate in some band's newer stuff. Woad was pretty cool, and I'm now obsessed with Deafhaven's newest album, Infinite Granite. So thank you, Winslow Dumaine, for feeling vulnerable enough to include some of your favorite stuff. You didn't have to do that, or I guess perhaps you did, since being vulnerable is kind of the whole point of this tarot deck. Look at them swimmers go. So thanks a ton for your patience while I figured my setup out. I really struggled to get this one recorded because I wasn't 100% certain how I wanted these videos to look like, but I figured the only way to find out was to just try different things out as I continue the journey. But of course, with that said, I'm hoping to continue improving the delivery of these book reports as I get a little bit more comfortable with the video, with the info that I present. But if there was something in particular that you were looking forward to in this book report, do let me know. Like, if there are any questions that you still have about this deck, if there are any is something that you think I might have missed, especially if you have this tarot deck, because I know that there's just so much detail in this deck that of course it would be like in a million-hour video for me to get through everything. But do continue to ask questions. Just be sure to keep things civil in the comments. Be sure to make discourse and not war. And with all that said, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Bye!